Okay, brilliant. Thank you everybody for coming along today to our very exciting webinar on NQF Works, exclamation point. My name is Caroline Croser-Barlow. I'm the Chief Executive of the Front Project, which is a national social enterprise working to support ECEC systems change. And I come to you from Ghana land today, and I pay my respects to Ghana elders past and present. And I acknowledge that we're all sitting on unceded Aboriginal land somewhere in Australia. I am very excited today to welcome uh, a really illustrious group of guests to this webinar. So I would like to welcome our speakers. We have Ms. Rowena Shirtcliffe from AERO. We have Professor Karen Thorpe and Dr. Peter Rankin from the best named institute in the country, the Queensland Brain Institute, the University of Queensland. And we have Mr. Lachlan Schmel from the less glamorously named Deloitte Access Economics. I'd also like to welcome everybody for coming along. So a little bit of housekeeping. This session will be recorded and we'll send out the recording and the transcript after the webinar. If you'd like to turn on closed captions, they're available. You press closed captions on the bottom of your screen. Please post questions in the chat box and we'll hopefully get to some of those at the end. And then at the end of the webinar, we will ask you a 3-question survey, and we'd appreciate it if you stick around to do that. So why are we here today? Look, this webinar is kind of notionally celebrating a policy explainer that the Front Project and Deloitte worked on together, but is really celebrating a fabulous piece of work that AERO commissioned from the Queensland Brain Institute, linking the National Quality Framework in Early Childhood Education and Care to child outcomes. So Lachlan and the team and my team came together because we were like, gosh, this piece of work is amazing and we're not sure everyone has heard about it. So how can we make sure people really, really hear about it? And also to do some of that thinking through about what are the policy implications of what this research tells us. And so as you can see, we've done some thinking about certainly just a quick summary on the attached slide of kind of what the piece of research tells us, but we'll hear a little bit more from our experts as we go through. And I think what's remarkable about these research is not that it kind of, children attending exceeding services have better outcomes than children in meeting services. Like that intuitively makes sense. What's remarkable is it's the first time we've been able to prove that actually the regulatory framework that we have put in place can be linked to outcomes for children. That's a big deal if you're a policy wonk like myself. It's very rare that we get to say, actually, we set out to do a thing, we implemented it, and the thing happened. And so that is really worth celebrating. So we're going to hear a little bit from the AERO team about and the University of Queensland team about the research. And then we're going to hear a little bit from Lachlan reflecting on kind of the policy takeaways that we can take from this piece of research, which you can see a little sneak preview of there. Things like both that NQS can deliver outcomes at scale, but also that we really need to prioritise quality. And we also need to think about what's happening for disadvantaged kids, because one of the things that our research shows is that quality is not evenly distributed in our system, which I am very sure is no surprise to anybody. But I would like to start now and hear less from me and more from our brilliant experts. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn to Professor Karen Thorpe, who has a brilliantly long title that involves many different words that, of course, now are not available on my screen. So I might get you to introduce your title, Karen. And maybe once you've introduced yourself, can you talk to us about why this project excited you? Why did you get involved?
Sure. So firstly, my long title is Australian Research Council Laureate Professor, and that designates that I have been awarded a laureate fellowship. And that fellowship is to look at how do we get the highest quality ECEC for the most disadvantaged children in Australia. So very on this topic. So
Yeah.
of course, very exciting to me. And this is big data analysis from Australia's integrated data set. And so it enables us to do things that we weren't able to do elsewhere. And Peter, I'm sure, will talk about that. But it's given us three big things. The first, it's told us it works, which you've already said. It also tells us what works, because one of the findings is that there are three things that are the most consistent, and that is relationships with children, the education program, and the environment that of the services. So those are three important things that tell us that these things are should be priorities. Doesn't mean other things shouldn't be priorities, but these are really important. And it also tells us what level, and it tells us that exceeding is where we need to go to shift the dial on disadvantage. So I know there's sometimes people say, well, we just need a minimum standard. This tells us that that alone is not what we need, that we need to keep aspiring for improvements. Fits beautifully with my laureate because I'm looking at how do we get exceeding services in those most disadvantaged areas. So that for me is exciting in terms of the findings. But to set this in a international, this is the first piece of work that has been done internationally that links a national quality framework because many places like the US don't have a national. They have it by county or state. And it's a large sample size, so it's a standard across the whole country, and it's an outcome using the AEDC across the whole country. And it's internationally significant. And nationally, I guess those of you who follow me are going to talk about policy. It says we are right to be investing in having a look at the quality. And it also shows us there are places where we might improve, and those improvements might be one or two places in how we assess quality, because we might not be asking quite the right questions. They could be refined, or in what they do. And I guess for research, which would be my final point, is it tells us this takes us to children in their first year of school. We need to then look at what are the effects long term, because when we talk about the impacts of early childhood, we don't want just the short term, we want the long-term impacts, and setting children on the right life course. And someone from a brain institute, we argue that it's those early years of brain development where we set up for life. So I'm going to stop there.
No, that was perfect. One of the things when you were mentioning kind of the international comparison, if anyone's been kicking around the policy space a lot, you often see kind of reference to particular studies. So like, the Perry preschool or the stuff that happened in the UK. Can you just reflect on, did you have a worry when you thought, oh, I'm going to look at the big data and it's not a carefully curated data set and no one's really kind of made sure that there's no consistency of input? Did you have a worry as you started that maybe you weren't going to be able to see what was coming?
Yeah, and look, across the international literature in studies, and including the study we did in Australia, E for Kids, which was a smaller sample size. So yes, you've got more noise in the system, but in some ways you don't. And Peter might talk about this because there were we're not relying on report, we're relying on other sources of information. Yeah, of course the worry would be, oh, well, maybe if we didn't find a result, we would go and have a look and say, is this a real result? And if it's not, that's important too. But
Yeah.
we would also have a look and say, well, is there some noise in the system? Of course, one thing in this data set is we don't have preschool in. We only have long daycare and family daycare services. So that's another thing that we would love to have integrated and have the states do that. But so what you've got in some ways is a little bit of truncation at the top end because they're more likely to have exceeding services. But so there's always, when we go in, we don't have a worry because we're not, we're on the outside.
Yeah.
But I imagine that AERO and and the SEQA probably had more worry, but it was lovely to find that the data did show that there's effects. And in the United States, for example, where there've been smaller studies of, voluntary, they are showing effects. This one is probably more important given the sample size and what we've found.
And just before I throw to Rowena to talk about what AERO was looking for from this work, you mentioned that one of the kind of things you really liked about this research is that it gives you more information about which elements of quality have a
Yeah.
bigger impact. Can
Yeah.
you just talk a little bit more about that? And was there anything in that that surprised you or kind of that you're thinking about unpacking more?
Not really. If you were going to pick the three, I think those would be it. But of course, staffing, and all of them were associated, but these were the three that were the most consistent. And I guess one of the things like staffing, was less consistent. I guess in terms of tweaking that, we've done lots of work in that workforce space. There are things in that I think could be in, like turnover rates and so on and so forth. So you could look at the items that are used to assess quality at that end. And some things are harder to assess by observation, like leadership. So there are things about how we measure those, and maybe it would help us to say, can we streamline those, or can we think about how they are measured? So that would, from my research perspective, that would be one of the things. I don't think it means ditch everything, but it might also mean that there's some streamlining, because one of the problems, of course, with assessment and rating is that it's not happening as frequently. So we would like to see that. If we can streamline down and look at which of those items are more pertinent, that might be
Yeah.
another way to go.
Excellent. And one final question for you, although it might be a question for Peter as well. One of the things that when I've talked to policymakers about this work, and I've said, look, it shows that children who ascend an exceeding service are more likely to have positive child development
Yeah.
outcomes. The policymakers say, sure, but like the exceeding services tend to be in the higher SES areas. And so like, you're just telling us that like posh kids do well. That's not kind of a thing. Can you explain in the clearest of language why that is not what you're just telling us?
Sure. So the posh kids do well, and they do get into services because they can pay more fees. However, when in the research we've done and for kids, for example, which was a study of 2,600 kids, what we know is that you do get exceeding centres in low income areas, which is what my laureate's about. What are they doing, and how do they achieve that? One thing we probably know is they're not for profit. But there's other things there, because some of them are. And so the question is, what are these services doing? So it is harder in those areas, but it's not impossible. And there are exceeding services in those areas, as are there working towards services in areas that you wouldn't expect that to be. So yes, as a general trend, you will see the higher the CIFA, or the advantage,
Yeah.
the more likely there are to be exceeding. But 21% of our services are exceeding, and so that's 80%. That's a call for 80% to shift up, and it's particularly a call, I think, for looking at how we resource services that are in the most disadvantaged areas, because what the research tells us definitely is that's where, if we can get the highest quality, we can make the most difference.
Beautiful. All
Mm.
right, Rowena, you are the brave commissioner of this research, which is always a bit brave as a public servant because you never know quite what's going to show you. Why did you do this?
Caroline, I think that's a really good question. I do want to acknowledge that AERO had commissioned the research before I had started. So I do want to pay full tribute to Zid, who is the head of research and evaluation here at AERO. But I think part of the role of AERO is to conduct research and share knowledge and evidence with policymakers and educators, teachers, providers, peak bodies and leaders that is relevant and helps them make informed decisions that lead to better educational outcomes. So we know early childhood services are a really essential part of the education landscape, the work that they're doing every day, the teachers, educators, service leaders, the decisions that they have to make every day is critically important. And I guess for us, what we wanted to do is start to go, well, what is it about quality that makes the biggest difference? And more than that, are there different aspects, or are there parts of quality that make a bigger difference, so that we can start to think about where we refine focus, where we think about where we invest, all of those sorts of different pieces around that. The other thing for us is that we know every service is on a quality improvement journey. So they're all working towards improving quality. We've got our regulatory authority working hard in terms of regulating for quality. And I guess for us, given the significant investment, and whether that's funding, time or effort, what we wanted to do is start to understand what are the parts or what are the pieces that fit under that we can help services, help policymakers, help large providers, peak bodies on that improvement journey, and really start to refine or affirm the work that they are doing in that space there. For AERO too, another benefit of this study, or a reason why we wanted to partner with the Queensland Brain Institute and Karen and Peter and the team, is that we want to continue to demonstrate how large-scale data can provide helpful insights for the sector. We know that there's a strong appetite for this, and we understand that data linkage and analysis in a way like this can contribute to building the Australian early childhood evidence base. And like Karen was talking, we haven't seen that done as significantly or in different ways. So I guess it's double-edged for us. We're super interested in being helpful and insightful and commissioning or doing research that makes an impact and makes a difference, not just nice to do and nice to look at. But we are also really interested in understanding how we can use large-scale data in a way that is helpful and insightful to decision makers in that space. I hope that answers the question.
It does. And I love how nuanced that is, because it's not like you're saying large scale data gives you the answer, right? You must do X or Y. You're thinking about how do you then parlay that into the continuous improvement journey. Was there anything in the report that surprised you when you looked at it? Like when you got the results and sat down with the team?
Look, I think coming from a teaching background myself, it wasn't a surprise, and I don't think it's a surprise for anyone connected to the sector, and like Karen had spoken about, but the consistent and strong link between children's learning and development with quality areas 1, educational program and practice, 3, physical environment, and 5, relationships with children. I think it affirmed what we know about the importance of educators and teachers, and that what they do, how well they interact, how they extend learning, how they support play, build relationships, understand development, makes a real difference. And it was interesting when I was thinking about this question and what surprised me. The reason is that the findings probably are still surprising to others. And I think that loops back to that importance of this work and the work of all of us in building awareness about the value and importance of the sector, and that quality is underpinned by a skilled, knowledgeable and supported workforce. So I think while I wasn't surprised, I still think it's surprising to people, a bit like you looked at the start around what happens and what does it do. And so I think it's still surprising in that space. But for those who live and breathe early childhood, not as surprising. But I think we've been thinking a lot about that, how we leverage the message to continue to raise awareness about the importance of early childhood and the difference that it does make.
See, so for me, in policy land, I think it always made sense, the idea that quality is connected to outcomes. I think what was surprising to me was that we had, in the design of the National Quality Framework, hit upon the right metric and the right process by which to measure and encourage quality improvement. Like, I guess maybe I'm a bit skeptical about government getting it right sometimes, but it was powerful to see. And you often hear people kind of get a bit down on the NQF sometimes, especially outside of the sector. And so for me, that really felt like part of the power. There was a really good comment in the chat about the challenge of if meeting isn't enough. I guess my reading of it was a little bit more nuanced. Meeting does do something, but exceeding does even more. Is that how you're playing it into your conversations, Rowena, when you're kind of encouraging improvement in the sector?
Absolutely. I think that what this is and what the study has shown is that the higher the quality, the better the outcomes are for children's learning and development in that space. And so while Karen spoke, and I know Peter will do it much more eloquently, talk about the thresholds that make the biggest difference and all of those things, I think we need to continue to acknowledge that we are on a continuous improvement journey, and services are doing the best work that they can in those systems and services. So I think for us, it's also the step back as policymakers and peak bodies and system leaders to go, well, how do we support that? And what do we need to do differently for services, or how do we wrap around services to continue to show that it makes a difference, but to also understand where it makes the biggest difference. So we've been really sensitive to that and this work, knowing that everyone is on a different pathway and a different journey, but actually we don't want to shy away from saying that exceeding should be where we're all aspiring to and what that looks like, but it looks different along the pathway to get there, and different services and different educators and different workforce will need different supports to get there in that space there.
I love that. It's nuance on both sides. It's nuance about what it looks like when you're there, and it's nuance about the path that you get to there. Hey, Peter, all right, now we're going to ask you to do the tricky thing of maybe describing the method that you guys use. So what exactly is, we've done a good job of talking around the edges of what it's told us, but actually, what did you do?
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, what did we do? Interesting. So, yeah, I guess, well, in studies of child development, we really want to learn, okay, how do children learn and develop, and what's the role of the experiences that they're having? So it might be quality of early childhood education. And so when we're doing that, we're looking, well, okay, we need to adjust for the background experiences of the children. But obviously, the two common problems we're facing is we don't often get a large enough sample when we go out there to account for the diversity of experiences. And also, it's really hard to measure those experiences. So the method we've used in this research is really using that large sample of children and that objective information about their experiences, what they're bringing before they come to childcare and at the same time, and using statistical methods, the latest and greatest, to really adjust, okay, once you put all children on an even playing field, try and compare like with like, you get an idea of what is the role of quality once you account for all of those things. So yeah, that's really the strength of this study is the large sample and the administrative data, allowing us to account for the different experiences of children in a really robust way, and it really gives a good confidence in the results in terms of, yes, it does look like quality is the thing that's making a difference compared to, say, it just being the posh children.
Which is
going
always
to
the
as
challenge.
high as which is interesting terminology. I can't exactly
Sorry.
write that in my papers, but it's okay.
So Peter, what kind of administrative data did you have access to? And just for everyone to be clear, this was de-identified. It's not like he had everyone's names or anything, but what kind of administrative data about children's backgrounds did you have access to, so you could sort of take that out of the equation? You could say, look, so holding this stuff equal. Like, what sort of stuff did you know about kids?
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's a very important point. Of course, we work with the Australian Bureau of Statistics in a highly confidential and private, insecure environment. So that's very important first off. But then in terms of the experiences of children, I think really when we think about the important drivers is the socioeconomic background. So we have data on income, for example, in a really robust way in terms of the data you would log in your tax return. We also have information about health service usage, so through the MBS and PBS. We have information on the census in terms of educational backgrounds, where the children are living, those kinds of things. And then obviously a very extensive history of the childcare usage. So when did children first go to childcare, how long they were in there, a range of things, and as well as migrant background, migrant status, how long have people been in Australia? Really getting a big grasp on some of those important things that shape the experiences that children have, even if it's not necessarily the mechanism that gets you there. But yeah, so really like a whole broad range of background experiences that we all identify in the literature that matter for both child outcomes, and then also are linked to the quality of services that children.
So that's what you then did, is you linked it to the ratings of the quality of the services, and you looked at each quality area. Is that right? So you didn't just say overall.
So I'll get ahead of myself. Yeah, we looked at the overall rating. So that's kind of across. It's I guess a harder standard to achieve because it involves multiple areas, and then we looked at each seven quality areas. So really comprehensive exploration of what matters and looking across the board. And I think when you're doing this kind of research, it's a bit exploratory. And so when you really see a consistent effect and a positive effect across all the different areas and the different ratings and the different methodologies that we used, it really gives you a great sense of confidence. We just haven't found one association, we found 400. So yeah, it's great.
And how did you measure the outcomes? How did you know that the kids were doing better?
Okay, so the measurement here is the Australian Early Development Census, and this is done in the first year of full-time school. So what's that called? In Queensland, it's prep, or other states, it might be kindergarten. And that measurement is kind of a robust compilation of measures that have been used for decades in the psychological literature. And the teachers have to know the children for a certain amount of time. There's a lot of quality control, and importantly and very impressively, I think it's about a 96% participation rate of the AEDC.
Yeah, way better than that plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they have a data governance committee as well. So there's a lot of checks and balances to make sure that, yeah, this is a pretty good approximation of how children are doing when they're entering school, and they're measuring important things that, in consultation with communities, schools, teachers, they've kind of come up with a list of some of the most important developmental outcomes for later life success. So yeah, it's very, very good.
So don't hide your outcomes. What are these 400 associations? What did you find?
Okay. Well, I mean, you have emotional. I better get the names right. So you have emotional competence. So that's things about like how do children get on with others. You might think of it like behavioral difficulties, things like that. So we find that, quality helps children with their emotional regulation. We also find it with their social competence. So how well they get along with other children and teachers. Again, higher quality, better social competence. You also see some interesting things. So like physical health and well-being, which is, a lot of the measures in there you might think might not be as, susceptible to outside influence. And yet, we see better physical health and well-being outcomes when children are entering school, which is quite, I think that's a very impressive outcome to move. And then there's also language and cognitive skills, and communication and general knowledge, which I guess is more about your communication side and how children are interacting with the literature and ability to learn as they move through the school system. So again, higher quality really shifted those outcomes. So.
And how big was the impact? Is it like, a little bit or a lot, or?
Yeah, I mean, the impact is always an interesting thing. So obviously you can find an effect, but what does that effect translate into the real world? And the ADC really focuses, I guess I'm just going to speak for my own opinion here, on, it's looking at developmental vulnerability. So you're really talking about the edges of the distribution, children who, if you can improve that outcome, it's going to make a massive difference later on. So hypothetically, 10% of children are kind of in that bottom category. If we're moving 1% of those children, you're thinking about 30,000 children who, back of the envelope calculations here again, we could obviously go in and validate it. And I'm kind of drawing on a bit of experience in other disciplines here that, those children might not need, a psychological intervention later on in life, or reduced doctor and hospital visits, or go on to really, essentially be at a very competent level and have much more development. Again, prefacing that's kind of like expertise speaking, as opposed to, really doing some validation work on that. But yeah, it really is like, when you're moving developmentally vulnerable children, I think it is making a big difference.
And so you found more impact for exceeding services for services exceeding in those particular quality areas than meeting, more impact for meeting them for working towards. Any other kind of key takeaways that we should do before we launch onto Lachlan?
No, I think, but that is an amazing takeaway. Like, we've linked measures to quality before, but it's really hard to identify clear differences between low, medium, and high quality. So it's really striking. You have that clear grading of quality, meetings making a difference, exceeding is making the most difference, and you can actually map that out. And that is very, very hard to do, and kind of a world first. And then, a final point is that we looked at, does this quality matter for several different socio-demographic groups individually? So different family backgrounds, and found, consistent effects. So yeah, it's really, really good to see.
It's exciting. And that holds across recognizing that regulation is enforced state-based. It kind of seems it holds across the slight variability of regulatory approach or regulatory enforcement as well. So that's interesting too. Lachlan, you got dragooned into this when I was pressing you to read this study multiple times and saying it's so amazing. Can it be real? What does it mean? Can you talk a little bit about what you think some of the big picture policy implications are for us from this?
Caroline, I definitely can. Thank you so much. I think, the first thing to say is what a wonderful time this research comes at. I think like incredibly timely. We know that there's a lot of connections to things that the Productivity Commission was thinking about, and we know Karen and her team and AERO were talking to the Productivity Commission throughout that. So it's wonderful to have this research now as the government considers what it does with those recommendations. And also as we're amidst the expansion that we're seeing across a number of states in preschool and kindergarten. Granted, that's not the focus of this research, but my sense is that there's a lot of transferable findings from it. I think there are a couple of headings that I grouped the implications under as I thought through them, and a couple of them have been touched on already, so I'll move through them quite quickly. I think the first is in relation to the National Quality Framework and the standard itself, and Karen commented on this in her remarks, and we know the Productivity Commission has suggested a further review of the NQF, and so I think it's to say that this evidence, this research shows the strength of the National Quality Framework and standard, but we know there's still areas for improvement. This research points to that. I love the idea that with that improvement could come the ability to address one of the other challenges, which is particularly the frequency of ratings, which we know now is well short of, particularly in some states and territories, well short of where it was intended to be. And so you see the Productivity Commission pointing to improvements in the consistency and quality, and especially in the frequency of ratings. And so I think the NQF and its design, we've heard from organisations like SNAKE around cultural appropriateness. So there's a variety of things there to strengthen what is clearly something that's working and is a wonderful foundation. And then the administration of it is very important as well. The second broad category I had was, I think, the policy implications related to balancing things like affordability and accessibility with quality. And certainly we've seen a lot of emphasis on affordability recently, and for very, very good reason. When we did the earliest work on the National Quality Framework, which our team was involved in, 15 or 16 years ago, there was a big focus on the cost of quality. And we understand quality costs, most certainly, but I think this research allows us to better understand why those investments are worthwhile, why we make them, and why we need to be thoughtful in how we balance things like expansions in access, expansions in provision with then quality, and particularly thinking around the workforce dimensions of that, which we know are so central to quality, and which we know can be a real challenge when we're trying to grow the workforce rapidly as we are at the moment. I think it's touched on those connections with disadvantage are so key here as well. We know that we do tend to see more services who are at the lower end of the rating spectrum in lower SES areas, and those are the families and children who we know benefit most from participation in early years programs and from quality. And so a real focus around that in a variety of ways is clearly very, very important. I think the last category I had, Caroline, was just thinking around how we recognise, reward and incentivise quality. We know it matters, we know it's important, we know it's making a difference to children, and we know if it makes a difference in AEDC, then it makes a difference through the schooling years and through life. But, are the mechanisms there to continue to incentivise and drive and reward services? We know we need to support and enable and invest, but on the other side is the market mechanism there, through parents' decisions and the way they vote with their feet, and in the policy design and the way we reward services when they're at particularly that exceeding level. So I think that would be a bit of a snapshot of our thoughts, Caroline, and of course, happy to delve deeper on any of those topics.
We have some excellent questions coming in through on the chat. So I might just sort of do them broadly chronologically, starting with how much confidence can we have that the results of this study can be interpreted for preschool settings, if any? This feels like a Peter or a Karen question. I'll let one of you jump in.
I can start and Peter might hop in. My feeling is it is relevant. We do know that there's less variability in preschool, so there are more centres that are exceeding and most are meeting from the snapshots that come through. So, but there are some differences in preschools, they're part-time programs and so on. So from my perspective, looking at children attending full-time, so they're at ECEC more hours in long daycare and family daycare settings. So we're looking at more effect. We're looking at more dosage, as it were. And so my guess is you're more likely to see an effect in this sample than if we put in the preschoolers. We put in the preschool, if we could, it would give you more at that end. But what I think the results are transferable, but of course preschool looks very different. Preschool has more early childhood teachers, it's part-day programs, and so it looks different. What we also know is some of those kids attending preschool are also attending long daycare services. But my feeling is that this would transfer, but because high quality in those programs is also important, and therefore, but they're just having lower dosage. So I think the effect should be stronger in this. But I'll hand over to Peter.
I think that's a great summary, Karen. Really here we're thinking about what is the measurement of quality, and we're finding, it's the relationships with children, physical environment. Again, the NQS has kind of been designed to capture what is quality. So I think it would hold when you looked at preschool settings, and then again, it's a little bit about like how many children do you need to look to quantify effect and statistical design. So it's like whether we replicate our exact findings here, or we might find something a bit different, we'd have to test. So very, very relevant question.
Well, and I think that leads us nicely onto, there's a bit of a chat in the group about how we measure quality, because it's so fascinating. What's exciting for me as a policymaker about this research is that it says the NQF and the kind of assessment and rating process is broadly useful, but we're getting the really, really granular and completely true feedback that people don't experience the assessments and ratings process as consistent, that people find that certain kinds of services feel like they're less likely to be awarded exceeding. There's a really good comment in there around some of our really disadvantaged areas in the north of Adelaide, feeling like when assessors and raters come along that they're not able to see the elements of quality because it's not kind of visible in that instant way because of the complexity of the cohort. And what's going on. So I guess I am interested in people's reflections on I think you said something before, Karen, about a baseline and then kind of thinking about improvement. But people's reflections on the NQF as an imperfect starting point, and do we think that imperfect starting point invalidates the key messages, or how do we think that interacts with the key messages from this report? And I'll open that up to anyone, but Rowena looks like she might have a little thing to go first, so I'll throw to her first.
Thanks, Caroline. Look, I think for us, and I'm interested too from Karen and Peter, their perspective, but we know that large-scale data can contribute to building the evidence base, but there is an additional opportunity to understand factors that contribute to quality. So this study, and Karen and Peter will be much better placed to talk about, talks about that large-scale, broad view. What does that look like across that in terms of validity and reliable findings in that space? And what we then know is underneath that, there's nuances and changes and differences that sit that we need to understand more about. And certainly from AERO's perspective, this isn't a piece of research that we're like, done and dusted, put on the fence, ready to go with the next thing. It opens more questions. It opens more understandings. It opens more for us around what's the digging underneath that once we look at different service types, or once we understand in different communities. And so it lends itself as a launch base or a start point for further conversations. But I think exactly as we've seen in the chat, there's lots of variance and there's lots of things that contribute to it. So I think it's not one or the other. I think it's about saying this is a starting base that contributes to the story, and we can see that overall. But we shouldn't stop asking the questions about what makes the biggest difference and where we can improve across from micro educator, systems right through up to large service systems and policymakers. Like, what can we do differently in that space? But I certainly think it's certainly not one or the other, but it's about, this is the start point to understanding it broadly, but there's a lot of work that needs to happen underneath around how you break that down and what that looks like in that space there. So that would be my perspective, I think.
Brilliant.
And this is like my favourite question, because I'm very, very interested in the construct of quality, how we measure quality, what is it? And what we're doing with the NQF is a standard, right? And we use that, and the standard by definition, in response to Richard, who's online, who I looked at his chat, and a standard by definition is inequitable. You look at the same thing in every single service, but when you've got children with more challenges, whether it be challenging behaviour, whether it be children coming in, as some of the studies we've done, hungry, without food, all of those things, that makes a difference. And that makes the educator's job different. You are responding to children in an education setting. You're not doing a standard thing. So of course it will look different. So I think we have to have that standard, and we have to aspire to exceeding, but we also need standard plus. And what we want is, and I think the Productivity Commission picked up on this very well, that what we want is, in those areas that have much more complexity, we can do things like support, change in ratios, support, and the NDIS coming in its foundation stage is looking at providing more supports in areas where we have more children who would have disability and not requiring a diagnosis, for example. So it doesn't just speak to, you can look at the NQF and say, oh, we're looking at a point in time and this is where we saw them, but it also tells us how we can improve, not only putting everything on the educator, but what about the system? How do we resource more for those educators? How do we get more educators in those services that are struggling to get workforce? How do we get the best teachers, more importantly, and the best educators in those services? Are the things that I think this speaks to. We've done a study of AOs, and we've looked at their actual, anonymously, but looked at all of the transcripts that come in from them in assessing services. And they do stay to what they're supposed to do in the NQF. And I think that also takes us back to what, whether there are some things that we could measure that are easy to measure and that might pick up on some of those contextual issues. But this is my favourite thing. This is what my laureate's about. And there are certain places where you see what we would call barometer events. And so you go into a mealtime and there's 12 toddlers and nobody speaks to them. You go into another centre, still low SES, still many children who are complex, and the beautiful language interactions are different. That is what distinguishes our exceeding and our working towards. That's the essence of it. And so I think the NQF is picking that up, but you've got to look at the other side. How do we look after the well-being of our educators? How do we resource better in those areas? Because otherwise it's inequitable. So we've got to use the NQF, we've got to use these ratings to tell us where we have to resource more.
I love that, and that is a most beautiful spot to finish. We could continue talking about this forever. I would like to just let everyone know that in addition to this great webinar, we have also secured a little social media video from the Honourable Julia Gillard AC, and you will find it on your socials, and I'm going to post a link in the thing, where she talks about what it was like for her starting off with this piece of work, and then now being able to see these results and these explanations and be like, yeah, that was really worth it. So consider it a love letter to the sector. We are incredibly pleased to have had this wonderful panel. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and go forth and have a great day. See ya.